My name's Tim Phillips, and I'm the Chief Executive at Phillips and Company Advisors. Our mission is to help you improve your life and financial strength, and one of the ways we can do that is by making sure you have great educational information as it relates to spending and investing. Now, one of the big challenges investors face, particularly if they're younger or starting out or transitioning, is really how do you endow your life? How do you possess your life, take control of your life? Well, one of the key concepts we want you to think about is the concept of what is enough. Now, we've asked our friend and best-selling author, Morgan Housel, who recently wrote the book, The Psychology of Money, to help explain the concept of what enough is. We hope you enjoy the video, and Morgan, let me throw it over to you.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you again to Phillips for letting me do these videos. I always enjoy doing them. And I want to talk a little bit today about what I think is one of the most important topics in all of finance, which is the concept of having enough. And I want to start this with a story that has nothing to do with money, but I think sets this up really well. And I want to tell you a story about this guy right here, Stephen Hawking, who of course was one of the smartest human beings to walk this planet over the last 100 years. I don't think that's an exaggeration. Stephen Hawking was just an absolute genius in understanding the universe, understanding how the world works, just an absolute savant. And a quirk of Stephen Hawking, of course, is that he had a motor neuron disease and he was paralyzed from head to toe. He had no control over his body. He spoke through a computer, of course. And he was not born like this. Stephen Hawking was born a perfectly healthy, able-bodied child, grew up as an athlete. He actually rode crew on the crew team at Cambridge during college. And he became afflicted with this illness, this disease, at age 21 and kind of lost control over his body after that. Now, a few years before Stephen Hawking died, the New York Times did an interview with him. And during the interview, he started talking about how happy he was and how amazing his life was and how excited he was to be working on these research problems. And the New York Times asked him, they said, quote, "Are you always this happy?" And his answer I thought was very interesting. He said, quote, "My expectations were reduced to zero at age 21. Everything else since then has been a bonus." And I love that idea, just this idea that how much benefit you get out of anything in life is not just your circumstances. It's not just what you have or how your life is today. It's your circumstances relative to your expectations that makes all the difference in the world. I think that idea applies to a lot of things in life, including how we think about money. And I'll show you what I mean. If you ask most Americans, when was the greatest time economically in the history of this country? What was the best time, the best decade in this country? Overwhelmingly, Americans will point to one decade, one period of time, and that is the 1950s. The glorious 1950s that we remember today as like the peak, the golden age of middle-class prosperity. Across generations, across socioeconomic groups, this is what Americans remember as the greatest economic period in the history of this country. And what I think is so interesting about this nostalgia for the 1950s, how we remember it as being such a great time, is how easy it is to prove, and how simple it is to prove that it is not the case that Americans were better off in the 1950s. That almost any way you look at it, we are better off today. Let me show you what I mean. In 1955, the average household, the typical median household, adjusted for inflation, earned about $29,000 per year. That was their annual income. By 1965, that was up to about $45,000 per year. And in 2020, it was $62,000 per year. Again, that's the typical family adjusted for inflation, twice as much income today as it had back then. And you keep going on down the list of what it was like in the 1950s, the glorious 1950s. The average new house was about half the size of the average new house today. The typical house in 1955 had one bathroom for 4 occupants. Today we have 4 bathrooms for 2 occupants. We've gone the complete other direction. Workplace desks were 3 times higher than they were back then, than they are today. Food took up an average of about 25% of a typical household's budget compared with about 13% today. And the average man over age 65 in 1955 was still in the workforce compared to less than 20% today. Most people in the 1950s worked until they died. That was the expectation, that was the reality. The idea of having a good, long, dignified retirement, that idea did not even exist back then. It's a very recent idea. And you can keep on going down this list of what it was like in the 1950s compared to today. And almost any way you spin it, we're better off today than we were back then. So then the question is why? Why do we have this nostalgia for the 1950s versus today? And there could be a lot of explanations for that, but I think one explanation is this. The way that we managed the economy, the way the economy worked in the 1950s was very unique and very interesting, which is that there was not a big gap between the rich and the poor. Of course, there was some gap, but not nearly as much what it is today. In the 1950s, you did not have hedge fund managers who were making billions of dollars. You didn't have athletes who were making $50 million a year. You didn't have CEOs who were earning 1,000 times what their workers made. That just did not exist in the 1950s. And I think what happened, because it does exist today, what really happened was that in the 1950s, it was easy to keep your expectations in check. It was easy to feel good about the lower incomes because that's what everyone else earned. And it was easy to feel fine about the smaller house because everyone else lived in a small house. Camping for a vacation felt fine and fun because that's what everyone else did. It was an era that was easy to keep your expectations in check because most people around you lived the same life that you did. And here's what I think has happened over the last 70 years. Our earnings, our income, our wages have doubled, but our expectations have more than doubled because we are surrounded, particularly with social media these days, in a world that is constantly inflating our expectations, inflating our aspirations, and creating this elevated definition of what a good life is. So even if our incomes have doubled, our expectations have more than doubled. And what this shows is I think there is an iron rule of finance that must be obeyed at all time, which is that if your expectations grow faster than your income, you will never be satisfied with your money. This is an iron rule of finance. It doesn't matter how much money you make, how much money you have. This equation has to be obeyed if you want to be happy with your money. And I'll show you an extreme example of what happens when you don't obey this rule. One of my favorite stories. Most of you who know who this guy is, this jerk, Bernie Madoff. Of course, one of the greatest financial fraudster of all time. His Ponzi scheme stole something like $20 billion from investors. But here's an interesting thing about Madoff's story that not a lot of people know. If you go back to before Madoff's Ponzi scheme, before the fraud began, he was earning, by some accounts, $30 million a year from the legitimate side of his business. Not the fraud, not the Ponzi scheme, his real, legal, legitimate business. He was making $30 million a year in the 1980s. He was honestly one of the richest and most successful businessmen in the country before the fraud began. And what's interesting to me about that little stat is that he apparently wanted more so badly. He wanted more money so badly that he was willing to start this fraud that ruined everything. And now look, if you are broke and you have a starving child at home and you rob a grocery store, I can kind of get my head around that behavior. But when you are this successful and you want more so badly that you're going to reach to the heights that he did, that to me is so fascinating. That to me is fascinating. And he's an extreme example, but I think we all have a little bit of that in us. That if our expectations exceed our income, we're never going to be satisfied. And for a lot of people, that means they will keep taking more risk, keep reaching further until they've gone too far and realize that they've taken too much risk, or realize that they've spent too many hours in the office, not enough with their family, whatever it might be. If you don't have a good concept of what is enough, you are likely to learn about it the hard way. I want to end with you with a story that ends us on a positive note that I think is so interesting. True story. Several years ago, two famous authors, Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller, were having dinner at the house of a famous hedge fund manager in the Hamptons. And Kurt Vonnegut turned to Joseph Heller and he said, "Joseph, do you know the owner of this house, the hedge fund manager, earns more money per month than you have earned in your entire lifetime?" And Joseph Heller said, "That might be true, but I have something the hedge fund manager will never have, and that is enough money." Thank you very much.